Picture this. It is a freezing Victorian morning, the kind that makes the windows sweat and the bedclothes feel like they were stitched from regret. Somewhere in a respectable bedroom, a woman is being sold to history as fresh, spotless, and faintly glowing, like a porcelain saint who never sweated, never bled, and never had a bad hair day. Cute story. Total gaslighting. The real Victorian morning was colder, harsher, and a lot less glamorous, because hygiene was not some endless spa fantasy. It was a daily negotiation with cold water, smoke, soap, and whatever the house could actually afford. By the 19th century, especially in Britain and the United States, middle and upper-class households had begun to treat cleanliness as a moral virtue as much as a practical one. But that did not mean everyone was walking around smelling like lavender and innocence. Indoor plumbing was limited or non-existent in many homes. Hot water took effort, and washing the whole body every day was not the universal routine modern people imagine. For many Victorians, the morning began with a basin, a pitcher, a sponge, and a face that had to be negotiated with icy water like it had personally offended the household. The bedroom itself was often chilly, because heating was expensive, uneven, and usually aimed at surviving the night rather than creating a cozy little wellness retreat. And here is the part the clean lady myth likes to skip, because it ruins the aesthetic. Women's clothing was heavy, layered, and difficult to wash. Dresses, petticoats, stays, chemises, stockings, and undergarments all trapped sweat, dust, and the general evidence of being alive. A woman might wash her face, hands, and neck carefully, maybe her feet, maybe her underclothes if water and labor allowed it. But a full-body wash was not always practical. Hair was brushed, pinned, and sometimes powdered or scented, yet hair care did not equal modern shampoo commercial purity. Even the language of the time reveals the obsession. Cleanliness was tied to respectability, self-control, and class. In other words, if you were clean, you were supposed to look morally sorted too. Very convenient. Very Victorian. Very Karen with a sermon. The truth is that hygiene in the Victorian era was uneven, seasonal, and deeply class-based. Wealthy households could afford servants, more water, better soap, and more frequent laundering. Poorer families had far fewer options. Bathing itself existed, of course, but it was not the universal daily ritual that modern people project backward onto the past. Public baths, sponge baths, washstands, and careful grooming all played a role, but so did inconvenience, cost, and plain old cold. Cleanliness was a performance as much as a practice, and the performance mattered because it signaled discipline in a society obsessed with order. So when you picture the perfect Victorian woman, all pale cheeks and immaculate lace, remember that the image was curated. Behind the curtain was a room that might be drafty enough to make your teeth chatter, a wash basin with water that could freeze your ambition, and a routine built less on luxury than on endurance. The truth starts in a freezing bedroom. By the mid-19th century, respectability had become a full-time job, and nobody got paid enough for the costume changes. If you were a woman, the day could begin with a wash at the basin and then spiral into a small avalanche of linen, stays, petticoats, stockings, and outer garments that all had to look effortless, which is adorable, because nothing about it was effortless. Cleanliness was not just about being clean. It was about looking disciplined, modest, and morally above reproach, like your body was supposed to apologize for existing. And if that sounds exhausting, that is because it was. The first layer was the one nobody romanticizes because it was doing the actual work. Chemises, drawers, and stockings took the sweat and the grime so the outer dress could stay presentable longer. In wealthy homes, servants handled much of the laundering, starching, ironing, mending, and airing out, which meant respectability was often built on somebody else's sore hands and burned fingers. In poorer households, the labor did not disappear. It just moved into the night, into cramped kitchens, into wash tubs, into the kind of domestic slog that turned one clean shirt into an all-day event. Soap cost money. Hot water cost fuel. Time cost everything. Then came the corset, that famously misunderstood piece of engineering that was less a medieval torture meme and more a structured undergarment meant to shape the torso and support the fashionable silhouette of the day. Women did not usually lace themselves into some cartoonish fainting machine every morning, despite what melodrama would like to sell you. But stays and corsets still mattered, and they had to be fitted, fastened, adjusted, and lived in. They shaped posture, they shaped movement, and they shaped the way a woman was read by everyone around her. A neat waist could signal order, refinement, and self-command. Translation: your body was expected to behave like a well-trained servant, and the labor never stopped at the waistline. Clothing had to be brushed, aired, repaired, and protected from soot, mud, kitchen steam, and city filth. A dress worn in public was not a disposable mood board. It was an investment, and often a fragile one. For middle-class women, preserving that image meant constant vigilance. For working-class women, it meant making do with fewer garments, mending them until the fabric practically begged for mercy, and trying to appear respectable anyway. That was the real trick of the era. Respectability was not a natural condition. It was a performance, and the stage was dirty. The same obsession followed people into the bedroom and the corridor. Chamber pots sat under beds, because indoor plumbing was still limited, and the night was not going to pause for convenience. A respectable household might keep the pot hidden inside a bedside cabinet or under a cover, but the function stayed the same. Someone had to empty it. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to wash it. And if that job sounds humiliating, congratulations, you have understood domestic service. In many homes, servants were the invisible machinery of dignity, lifting waste before dawn so the family could pretend the house had always been tidy, sweet-smelling, and blessed by the angels of denial. Across class lines, the rules were different, but the pressure was the same. Middle and upper-class women were expected to look composed, pale, and carefully arranged, even when the reality beneath the lace was sweat, confinement, and a small army of household tasks. Working women had fewer layers, fewer servants, and fewer illusions, but they still had to present themselves as decent in a society that judged morality by hems, collars, and whether your boots looked like they had lost a fight with the street. The whole system was a racket. A filthy, exhausting, very Victorian racket. By the 19th century, the female body had become a public obsession wrapped in private shame. Menstruation was still treated like a problem to be managed, hidden, or politely ignored, which is a charming way of saying that half the species was expected to bleed quietly and keep the furniture clean. Girls often learned about their cycles from mothers, older sisters, or servants, not from any reliable medical authority, because medicine itself was still busy gaslighting women with a straight face. The result was a culture of silence so thick you could practically hang a petticoat on it. What passed for knowledge was usually a mashup of household lore, moral warning, and bad science wearing a respectable hat. Many doctors, especially in the earlier part of the century, treated menstruation as a sign of weakness, delicacy, or biological instability, as if the uterus were a temperamental little Karen demanding attention. Some believed that menstrual blood had to be drained away to preserve health, while others insisted that too much activity, too much study, or too much emotion could disturb the monthly rhythm. Women were told to rest, but also to remain useful, to be careful, but not dramatic, to endure, but never complain. A perfect system, if your goal was to make suffering sound like etiquette. Mothers stood at the center of this mess. They were the ones who taught daughters how to improvise with cloth, how to wash and hide stained linen, how to keep a face still when pain arrived without warning. In many households, the first period was a moment of instruction and alarm all at once, because it marked the border between girlhood and womanhood in a world that loved turning biology into morality. A daughter who bled was no longer just growing up. She was now expected to understand restraint, secrecy, and the social risk of being noticed. The body had spoken, and society immediately told it to lower its voice. Medical writers did not help much. In the 18th and 19th centuries, menstruation was often folded into theories about the female constitution, a phrase that could mean anything from frailty to hysteria, depending on who was doing the talking. Physicians linked irregular periods to nervous disorders, poor digestion, moral excess, and reproductive failure, because apparently if a woman felt unwell, the whole universe needed to accuse her character. Some doctors advised bleeding, purging, or restrictive living. Others recommended fresh air, moderate exercise, and a sensible diet, which was at least less theatrical than the old habit of blaming the moon, the nerves, or a woman's reading habits. And then there was the social rulebook, always lurking like a chaperone with a stopwatch. Menstruating women were often expected to withdraw from public life, limit movement, avoid bathing in some settings, and maintain an appearance of calm no matter what their bodies were doing behind the scenes. Servants and factory workers had less room for such delicacy, of course, because wages do not pause for cramps. They worked through pain, through leakage, through exhaustion, through the sort of monthly inconvenience that was only inconvenient if you had the luxury of pretending it was not happening. Wealth could buy more linen, more privacy, more discretion. It could not buy honesty. By the late 19th century, reformers and some physicians began to pay closer attention to women's health, but even then the language stayed cautious and moralized. Menstruation was discussed as a delicate subject, something to be managed with discretion, as though the real danger was not the pain itself but the scandal of admitting it. That silence had consequences. It kept girls ignorant, made women anxious, and left ordinary suffering wrapped in medical fog. Even pain was made to sound improper. In the grand houses, hygiene was not just a habit. It was a performance, a privilege, and a quiet little lie with polished silver on top. While the rich could summon water, privacy, and time like obedient servants, everyone else had to wrestle cleanliness out of a day that was already trying to kill them. Same century, same cities, wildly different realities. One class got a bath, the other got a lecture. By the 19th century, wealthy households in Britain and Europe could arrange their lives around domestic labor. Water had to be carried, heated, and hauled again. So if you had servants, you had the closest thing to a miracle on demand. A lady of the house might wash at a basin in her room, behind a closed door, with fresh linen laid out like a stage costume. A gentleman could shave, sponge, and change clothes without ever touching the logistics of his own body. The house itself became a machine for concealment. Dirt was not erased so much as managed by people who were paid to make it vanish before breakfast. Servants lived in the engine room of that fantasy. They rose earlier, stayed later, and handled the endless physical work that made other people look effortless. They carried water upstairs in buckets, scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, boiled linens, and cleaned up after the family's bodily evidence like unpaid witnesses to the whole glamorous fraud. Privacy was not theirs. Time was not theirs either. A maid could not simply disappear for an hour because she felt unwell or needed to wash. She worked where she was seen, and often where she was needed most, which meant that cleanliness for the upper class was built on the exhaustion of the lower. Factory women had even less mercy. In the textile towns and industrial districts of the 19th century, women worked long hours in mills, workshops, and laundries where heat, dust, grease, and sweat were part of the job description. The clock did not care that a woman had children, cramps, bleeding, or a body that needed rest. If she was late, she lost wages. If she stopped, someone else took her place. So hygiene became improvisation under pressure. A quick wash if there was a basin. A change of linen if she owned enough. A wipe with whatever cloth could be spared. Not elegance. Survival. Not privacy. A corner, a sink, a minute stolen from the machine. And then there were the poor, for whom cleanliness was often a question of access rather than intention. In crowded urban districts, water could be hard to fetch, expensive to heat, and shared by too many people. Housing was cramped, ventilation poor, and washing space minimal. If a family lived in 1 or 2 rooms, then bathing was not a serene ritual. It was a logistical ambush. Children, work, illness, laundry, and food all competed for the same narrow patch of time and floor. When every bucket had to be earned, hygiene stopped being a moral ideal and became a resource problem. That is the part polite society loved to forget while preaching about character. Public bathhouses, washhouses, and later municipal reforms tried to answer the problem, but they did not erase class difference. They merely exposed it in a new form. The people with money could bathe at home, behind doors, with hot water and spare towels. The people without money had to queue, share, and hurry. Cleanliness was never just about soap. It was about who controlled water, who controlled space, and who controlled the clock. In that world, class did not merely influence hygiene. Class decided who could be clean enough. By the late Victorian years, the house was finally getting some plumbing of its own, which sounds glamorous until you remember that indoor water closets began to spread in better-off homes after the Public Health Act of 1875 and the Sanitary Act reforms, and suddenly the old comedy of the chamber pot had a rival. Flush toilets were not universal, not cheap, and not always reliable, but they were a real shift in domestic life. The same era brought piped water farther into cities, and that changed the rhythm of washing in ways that actually mattered. Hot water could be drawn more easily. Baths became less of a military operation, and bathrooms slowly moved from fantasy to feature. But let's not gaslight ourselves into thinking every Victorian terrace suddenly turned into a spa. Many houses still had no proper bathroom at all, and in working-class districts a tap, if there was one, might be shared, distant, or temperamental enough to ruin your whole day. Modern comfort was arriving, yes, but it was arriving like a late guest who had to be let in through the side door. Then came the small inventions that made cleanliness feel less like a punishment and more like a routine. In 1888, the first commercial paper sanitary towel was introduced in the United States, and disposable menstrual products began their slow, uneven march into everyday life. Paper handkerchiefs, sanitary pads, and other throwaway goods promised convenience, privacy, and less laundering, which was a very Victorian way of saying, please stop making women wash this in secret forever. These products did not instantly solve anything. They were expensive for many, awkward to buy, and not always widely available. Still, they pointed toward a future in which bodily care could be hidden a little more efficiently and managed with less labor. Soap itself became cheaper and more common over the 19th century, and manufacturers learned how to sell cleanliness as a moral personality trait with packaging. That was the real Victorian hustle. Clean skin was not just clean skin anymore. It was discipline. It was respectability. It was the social equivalent of telling everyone you had your life together, even if your sink was leaking and your nerves were hanging by a thread. Advertising, department stores, and mass production helped turn hygiene into a consumer habit, and suddenly the market was selling not only soap, but the dream of being the sort of person who used it properly. But the limits were still obvious, because infrastructure does not magically erase inequality. In many towns, sewage systems lagged behind population growth, and overcrowding kept disease close to home. A flush toilet in one house meant very little if the street outside still stank like a public insult. Clean water, drainage, and waste removal had to be built district by district, and that took time, money, and political will. So yes, the century ended with more bathrooms, more soap, more paper goods, and more talk about sanitation. But it also ended with plenty of people still improvising, still sharing, still waiting for the future to reach their block. That was the Victorian trick in a nutshell. The age loved to present itself as civilized, polished, and scientifically improved, but the reality was messier, patchier, and much more unfair. Comfort came in waves, not miracles. A wealthy household might get a flush toilet, a washstand, and a stack of disposable goods, while a poorer family still hauled water and made do with whatever could be scrubbed, rinsed, and reused. The modern bathroom was being invented, but it was not being distributed like a blessing from heaven. It was being filtered through class, cost, and geography, which is a very polite way of saying that progress showed up unevenly and late.